Hello and welcome to Eco Show number 2. We're here in the second week of this year, 2023, and we have a lot of interesting things to talk about today. Shout out this week to a website called Good News Network, because I found a lot of saw these articles through that website initially, and then went to find the research articles on those papers and research. So we've got sea monkeys in danger. That's the hook for today, and you're gonna have to wait for it. You're gonna have to wait a little bit. So I apologize for that a little bit. But let's start with some good news. Some good news is that 146 new species of animals and plants were added in 2022. So new species were found. There's species going extinct as well, but this article from Good News Network was focusing on new species that were found. So those species included fish, rays, lizards, spiders, scorpions, and plants. And in particular, 44 lizards, 30 ants, 14 sea slugs, 14 flowering plants, 13 sea stars, 7 fishes, 4 sharks. 4 sharks. Can you believe that? They must have been, I don't know what type of shark those were, but that's wild to think about, that there were 4 sharks that people hadn't specied before. 4 beetles. I'm kind of surprised there weren't more beetles, because there's a lot of beetles out there in the world. 3 moths. 3 worms. I don't know why that's funny, but 3 worms, 2 scorpions, 2 spiders, 2 lichens. I would think that would be challenging to species license lichens. And lichens, if you're not sure, sounds like the type of werewolf, but it is the sort of thing that you'll see on rocks, and it looks kind of leafy. It looks kind of like moss. There was 1 toad, 1 new species of toad, 1 clam, 1 aphid. That seems like another challenging thing as well to discover, aphid. And my favorite, last but not least, 1 sea biscuit. And a sea biscuit is the sand dollar. So there you have it. Those are all the different sorts of things that were found anew this year. And the discoveries of scorpions were by high school students. So it's never too early, it's never too late to find new species. So if you see something, let people know. I think this looks a little crooked. Okay, so starting off with some good news there. So there's lots of new species in the world. That's cool. Or there's new species being discovered, doing air quotes there. New species, very cool. Another article that we're moving on to is that so this show, if this is your first time watching the show, I'm talking about eco-related things, usually new research and news, but it could be other things. So we'll see where it goes. But today I'm just going through news that's related to eco things, and that is pretty wide-ranging, as we'll see from this article, which is a discovery or a big project that was mapping the interior design of the human cell. So there took 200,000 3D images of cells, and it was a particular type of cell. And when I started looking into what this type of cell was, it fell over my head. So we can keep it at the simplistic level of cells. In particular, it's called an iPS cell. And they're wanting to get a better understanding of how the insides of cells are arranged. So we've all probably seen in elementary school or middle school or at some other point the diagram of the inside of the cell, but they were looking at how often do things really turn out to be that way. And they found that things do tend to organize the internal structures in similar ways, even if the overall shape of the cell may change. The way the internal components are organized tends to be similar, and cells at the edges of colonies have particular shapes. So people are looking at cells, they're looking inside cells and understanding that. So there's some cell-related news, and the better we understand those really small-scale things, the better we're able to scale up those findings. Okay. Let's see. The next thing is... Oh, this is going to be good. And this might have actually, depending on my decision later, this may have started the podcast today, but I haven't decided. So either way, you're going to hear a bird. It may have been at the start of the podcast. It may be now. Actually, let's say it was at the start of the podcast and it's now. I'm a mind reading. So during the opening sequence, there wasn't a song this time. There was the sound of the bird, and that bird was the scaly-breasted wren, scientific name Microcirculus marginatus. Microcirculus marginatus. And what's interesting about the call of this bird is that it has big gaps in time between the different spaces and the different points in its song, and it's really hard for any sort of animal to measure time. So this bird does it particularly well, and does it, they're finding, as well or better than human musicians. So that sort of counting in your head, it was able to replicate its own call and the gap in time between these calls really well. And I'm going to rewind really quickly here because the cell article was called Integrated Intracellular Organization and Its Variations in Human iPS Cells. And that was by Matheus P Viana et al. So shout out, credits to them. And back to this bird situation. That's about all we have to say about that. And the article was titled Precise and Non-Scalar Timing of Intervals in a Bird Vocalization. And that was by Carlos Rodiguez-Saltos. And I was having a thought yesterday, which I'm segueing to I was thinking about how how the way we think about numbers are in terms of tens. Like 10 makes up 20, and then 100 and 1,000. And I was thinking about if that is because of us having 10 fingers. Because there's no real reason that we need to have that many numbers in this idea of a 10. 10 in terms of being sort of a base that we count by. So there you go. There's a random thought that I was having yesterday. Okay. Next on the news is that there was research being done in Guatemala with LiDAR, which is light detection. It means light detection and ranging. And it's a way that you may have heard of that people can look at the surface of the earth and they can use these lasers to see indentations and things in the earth's surface and sort of look below trees and things like that. So you may have heard before that there are some big discoveries in Central America where they were finding different temples and things like that. And so they've had another really big discovery. And this was from doing this laser analysis over a really large area in Guatemala. And this method of using lasers, why it's been so groundbreaking, is that before archaeology you'd have to dig, there would maybe be more approximations and different layers in the ground. So I don't know if LiDAR can do layers very well, but it can certainly get it indentations in the direct surface of the earth. But anyway, so they were using this over a large area, and in this area called the Mirador-Calakmul Karst Basin. And they found 900 habitations, 4 large cities, thousands of yards of raised causeways, 30 ball courts, 195 cement reservoirs, so for holding water and things like that, 111 miles of elevated walkways connecting 417 villages. And the thing about this that was the wildest to me was that they're estimating this was in the pre-classical period, which was from 2000 to 250 AD. And so that is pretty wild to think about, that in that time period, how big this one particular area, who knows how connected and built up it was to other cities and things in the direct areas. So more discoveries. Maybe see if you can, what's some LiDAR that's happening near you. Maybe there's some interesting discoveries going on. You never know how far back it was that people were hanging out, were building habitations, ball courts. That's definitely a sign of humans. If there is a ball court, that was we love playing sports. Okay, and so that was by Richard Hansen et al. And the title of that article was LiDAR Analyses in the Contiguous Mirador-Calakmul Karst Basin, Guatemala, an introduction to new perspectives on regional early Maya socioeconomic and political organization. So implications from this is showing that this was a highly developed area agriculturally, infrastructure-wise, and they argue or mention that this would lead to the idea that there would be probably a lot of similar ideas around how things should be organized politically in order for things to be that organized. Okay. And if you're listening on to this as a podcast, hello, I hope you're enjoying this. But I will be popping up a few images for each of these articles on the YouTube. So if you'd like to see some images, we'll throw up some species up there. There was one in particular, this something or other wrasse, I believe it called it. It was this beautiful rainbow colored fish. So there'll be images of things going on that I'm talking about. Holy mackerel, it's 16 minutes already. Okay. Okay, moving on. We've talked about birds, we've talked about LiDAR, and we still have yet to get to the sea monkeys. They're in danger. They can only be safe if you make it to the end of this podcast / YouTube video. We have a few more. We have a few more things until we get to the sea monkeys. Okay, so a couple of these articles were also on Good News Network, but I couldn't tell if it was greenwashing, but they were interesting. Anyway, so there's this one article that was about a British company that develops the first tractor in the world to be completely powered by cow dung. So last week we were talking about bovine urine, and this week we're talking about bovine fecal situations. And the way that they are saying this can happen is that this company has developed a tractor that can run on methane, essentially. And I didn't realize this before looking into it, but methane is the primary. It's a gas. It's a combustible gas. And it is the primary component in natural gas. So when you think of natural gas, we're talking about methane. And natural gas is for sure a greenwashing term. Because methane, when you combust it, it still produces carbon dioxide, but it's like more bang for your buck. So when you burn it, the amount of carbon dioxide that's produced from it is like the most efficient for the amount of heat that's also combusted. So it is lower emissions than other things when used as a combustion source, but it still is putting carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So anyways, this company has developed a tractor that can run on methane, and they're like, hey, cow doo-doo produces methane, and you can set up a little thing on your property so you can just toss your cow dung in this little extractor and it'll get the methane out, and then you can use it to run your tractor. But I have a feeling that the amount of methane coming from cow doo-doo is not really going to be running a tractor for you. But it is interesting to think about. It's interesting to know what people are doing. Tractors are important. Do you like to eat? Probably came on a tractor. So that's good to know. It's good to know what's going on in tractor world. It would be interesting to know what people who use tractors think about this. Now the thing is, this methane powered tractor, it needs to be kept at a very low temperature. So I feel like this would be kind of a pain to maintain and things like that. But, people are really determined to continue to combust things. So, and we're going to continue to eat. So it's kind of a cycle that's going on there. Okay. And I'm going to get the other possible greenwashing article out of the way. Because this is I like this website, Good News Network, but sometimes with smaller, and it's a .org, but sometimes a lot of, regular newspapers as well will get sort of sponsored articles and things like that. So it's good to be aware when you're reading an article from really anywhere that sometimes if it, you want to read positive articles, but if things are a little bit too positive, there's a chance that somebody paid to get that article written in that way. And that's not anything against, anybody. I'm not hating that. Just it happens, and it's good to know. Okay, so this other possible greenwashing article is that they are saying that they can, and by they, I'm talking about this mining startup, which a mining startup just doesn't sound like it's going to end great. I feel like what startup, I don't know if there's any startup. I'm sure there's some good startups out there in the world, but at least in the way that I think about startups, it usually seems like it ends badly. And a mining startup just does not sound like it's going to end well. But anyway, so this startup is saying that we're going to capture carbon dioxide, which is a greenhouse gas, which warms and leads to climate change. And we're going to inject it into volcanic rock, which is plentiful in a barren part of Kenya. So what could go wrong? I think a lot of these times that trying to solve these issues with more technology is not a great thing, but it's still, again, interesting to know what different industries are doing. What are mining people doing? Besides farming and mining are two things that we don't think about very much, but man, oh man, pretty much. I remember somebody saying something at some point that was along the lines of everything you have, if it wasn't mined, it was grown. And that's pretty much, besides maybe rainwater, that's pretty true. So good to be aware of what mining related things are happening. So this startup wants to inject carbon dioxide into volcanic rock because apparently volcanic rock can keep that carbon dioxide down there, and it's being done in other places in the world. So Iceland is doing it. If Iceland's doing something, that seems pretty cool generally. So why not jump on the bandwagon? And there's lots of volcanic land in northern Kenya. The big thing in northern Kenya is that there's a lot of geothermal activity and a lot of potential geothermal energy to be harvested from there. So the general idea that's going on there, because it takes energy to inject this carbon dioxide down into this volcanic rock where it can apparently be isolated, is that you can use that geothermal energy to power that process of putting the carbon dioxide down in the ground. So that is something that is happening. And yeah, so some places there's issues around geothermal. I'm not sure what the geothermal situation is like in Kenya, but it's an interesting idea. And then the idea is that there's this whole idea of carbon credits where people basically have to pay to pollute in some ways. And so then countries that are polluting a lot, like New Zealand or Australia or other developed countries where there's a lot of emissions going on, they can then buy these carbon credits to sort of pay for the polluting that they're doing, which is then sending money to Kenya. So a lot could go right and a lot could go wrong, it sounds like, with that. But interesting thing to hear about. And we are getting close to that 30-minute mark. So I'll just double check. I think we've just about made it to... Okay, and another interesting note, I should have paired this with the Guatemala research, but there's some other research that was really fascinating going on in Mexico that was looking at an agricultural calendar that would have been used by the Mexica, which is the name that the Aztecs called themselves. And they found this information in old Mexica manuscripts that they had this observational area where they would look out to the mountains from this one place and see where the sun was rising and setting from. And that would inform what point in the year they were in and when to grow and plant different seeds and things. So that's pretty cool they were doing that. And that article was called Ancient Inhabitants of the Basin of Mexico Keep an Accurate Agricultural Calendar Using Sunrise Observatories and Mountain Alignments. So I can't say the title outright because that is everything that I just said. And that was by Hekiel Ekura et al. I'll put the names of these in the show notes so you can check them out. Okay, on to the sea monkeys. You've waited to save the sea monkeys, and we're going to go over half an hour, so I hope you're in for it because we're going to go through this and then we'll have some icing at the cake because this isn't very happy news. And so what we're going to talk about is the Great Salt Lake. Hopefully, I put an image right here. Great Salt Lake is in Utah. It's a very large lake, and to be particular, it's the largest saltwater lake in the Western Hemisphere. I'm not sure where the Western Hemisphere starts in particular. Is it the Atlantic Ocean? You can just go around and around the world, and the West is everywhere. But anyways, it's the largest in the Western Hemisphere, largest saltwater lake, and it's the 8th largest terminal lake. And by terminal lake, we're talking about lakes where it's the end of the road. There's no way back, Jack, from that. So it's very large. It's in Utah. It's very shallow as well, though. So on average, it is 16 feet or 3 or 4 meters deep. So it's this massive saltwater lake in Utah, which is about in the middle of the United States, which is in the Western Hemisphere, which is on planet Earth. And there is issues going on with it because people like water, and they're taking a lot of water from the streams that feed into the lake as well as from the snow that feeds the lake. So there's more water allocated for people uses than there is for the lake itself. And it's been policy there that if farmers didn't use the water that they were allocated, that they could lose the water rights to it. So like all things, it's more complex than you think it is because people we're having to use the water, which is basically a sort of incentive from the government in that situation to say, hey, grow as much, use as much as you can. We want to really produce. PRODUCE. We want to produce. And so this research in particular is saying that the Great Salt Lake, I should have said this first, is on track to disappear in 5 years. Yeah, that's not 500. That's not 5 times 10, 50. That is 5 years. And that's because of this water allocation issues. And you may think, well, it's a big salt lake. From what it looks like to me, it looks pretty barren. I don't know if it's, that big of a deal. I don't think many people are thinking that, but you might be thinking that. And if you are, I kind of thought that as well. To some respects, when you look at it, at least on a map, it looks like desert around it. But when you drive this lake, you have a few major issues. The one is health hazard. When you have this lake dry up, you have very fine dust particles and lots of elements in it. So dust on its own is really bad for human health and bad for your lungs. And there's a lake in California that was drained that's a huge health hazard to the local community there, and it was drained to feed California, but to feed Los Angeles in particular. And so that's sort of what the Great Salt Lake in Utah is on track to do as well, is to be dried out. And when it's dried out, it's going to be tricky going back. And so, one issue, huge health hazard, like catastrophic health hazard for our people's health. And number 2 / number 1, if you're a bird, is the ecosystem would be completely destroyed. And it's already a ecosystem on the brink there. And so the Great Salt Lake is habitat for 10 million birds a year, which is a lot of birds. And what they do is they go down, they hang out, they're either traveling or maybe they live around there. Maybe it's vacation, but they eat brine shrimp and brine flies. And guess what brine shrimp are? Sea monkeys. They're sea monkeys. Brine shrimps are sea monkeys, and you very well may have had brine shrimp / sea monkeys that were from the Great Salt Lake. So we're getting some more intense lighting as well. Yeah, brine shrimp and these brine flies are, so it's already, because it's getting over allocated, the concentration of salt relative to water is higher, so the water's saltier, and even though these brine shrimp and flies are built to live in it, it's getting harder and harder for them to survive in there. And another issue is that a lot of the snow that Utah is known for, so there's skiing and things that are known in Utah, and a lot of that is there because of the lake to begin with. So when the air moves over, cold air moves over this warm lake water, and that lower layer of air that's near the lake is a little bit warmer, and it gets picked up and moves up through that air, and then it's deposited as snow downwind. So without the lake, then your source of water to the lake is also limited. So this lake has gone from, in 1987, being 3,300 square miles. So if you imagine 3,300 squares and then make that into a mile, that's how big it was. I don't have a good idea how big that was, but it was big. And in 2022, it was 950 square miles. So it's decreased to about a third of that. So it's low and getting lower. Let's see. Also, there's a lot of magnesium and lithium that are extracted from that brine, so it's a really important industry as well that would be lost. And they need to cut their water use there by 50%. So they're asking for a pretty big cut. They've got a lot of snow this year, so they're so far this year. So if the amount of snow they get keeps up, then they'll be okay. But if they don't cut their water uses drastically, it's going to be a little rough. Okay. So that was the sea monkeys. Because you listen to that, hopefully a few sea monkeys are going to be able to be okay. And just to end today's episode with some good news, if you've made this far, is okay. And that article, that research was by Ben Abbott, and the name of the article was Emergency Measures Needed to Rescue Great Salt Lake from Ongoing Collapse. Not saying it's going to happen, saying it is happening. Okay, so our last article that we're talking about is that there was a vaccine for honeybees approved by the U.S. Department of Agriculture for conditional use. And so there's this disease called foul brood disease, which is a bacterial disease that gets into honeybee colonies, and the only solution that they've really had for it was that you have to burn everything. Burn your tools, burn the whole thing down, because that's the only way to get rid of the bacteria. So huge amounts of honey and bees were being lost to this every year. But they are trying out this vaccine now, which was noted in this article as being GMO free, which I don't know how they would genetically modify it anyways. But anyways, this vaccine is eaten by worker bees and then incorporated into the royal jelly, which is the sort of food that feeds and develops the queen bee. And when the queen eats it, she gets the vaccine, and that vaccine goes to her offspring. So it's just an inoculated version of this bacteria so that these bees are able to have defenses to it. So they're trying that out, and hopefully it works, because that is, one of the most widespread and destructive honeybee diseases. So that's about it. It's pretty dark now. I hope you've made it to this point. I hope you're having a great week, and I hope that's everything I meant to talk about. We will catch you next time. See ya.